Hello, my name's Andy Critchlow. I'm Head of News at S&P Global Commodity Insights, and welcome to the Look Forward podcast from S&P Global. In today's rapidly shifting markets, success depends on anticipating what's next. The professionals who excel are those who can spot emerging trends before they fully materialize. The Look Forward podcast delivers exactly that. Insights to help you prepare for tomorrow's opportunities and challenges. We bring you expert perspectives on macroeconomic trends, capital markets, energy transition, and global trade, with a sharp focus on what these developments mean for the decisions that will shape your tomorrow. This podcast connects you with S&P Global's Look Forward Council, bringing cutting-edge research on long-term trends and transformative market shifts. Together, we're committed to providing the forward-looking intelligence you need to navigate uncertainty with confidence. So welcome to the latest episode of the Look Forward podcast. My name's Andy Critchlow. I'm Head of News at S&P Global Commodity Insights, and I'm here joined by Joshua Hutchinson, Managing Director of Risk and Intelligence at Ambrey, the global maritime security and intelligence company. And we're here to discuss one of the most fascinating subjects facing global trade at the moment, which is security on the water. Is the rule of free trade on global sea lanes, free and uninterrupted transportation of goods and services, oil, commodities, is that now under threat from geopolitical actors, from terrorist actors, from militants? We've seen attacks in the Red Sea. We've seen attacks globally on shipping in multiple different jurisdictions, and we're here to get into that subject today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Just how serious, I kind of paint somewhat of a dramatic situation there or picture, but, from our reporting, news reporting, we're constantly reporting about attacks on tankers, attacks on shipping, real threats to trade. Is this overblown, or do you think this is real?
Thank you very much for having me.
Pleasure.
I think there's two ways to look at this. The threat today fundamentally is as severe as it sounds. We're hearing of unfortunate fatalities within the Red Sea and within the Gulf of Aden from a particular threat actor that I'm sure we'll come on to. But also the amount of events that are happening globally are definitely being captured better. So there's two ways to look at an increase of data. Ambrey reports around sort of 5,000 to 6,000 events every single year in relation to security, where we look at really war, crime, narcotics, activism, and migration. If you look back sort of 15 years ago, was the same available data, available? Maybe not. So whilst there is a natural increase of events being captured, yes, fundamentally the severity is increasing. We're seeing, we were talking sort of previously around Somalian piracy. This is, automatic 7.62 caliber weapon systems being fired. And in the last sort of 2 years, we're now seeing anti-ship ballistic missiles that you would usually see in wartime, and the evolution of kinetic, unmanned aerial vessels, unmanned surface vessels, never really seen before at this scale. So the severity is as stark as you say it is.
It's interesting what you say there around the scale of the attacks and the mode of the attacks. We've gone from pirates using small arms to, as you suggest, drones, ballistic missiles, etc. Back in 2007, I was embedded on USS Stennis, actually, in the Gulf, and they were involved in operations in Afghanistan. And I remember talking to the captain, and he was saying that. And I asked him the question, how vulnerable is this ship to attack? And he said, well, this is one of the biggest ships in the world. We can take anything on. The thing that really worries us is, 3 men in a dinghy, actually. Is that what they mean by asymmetric warfare?
And I think it's interesting, isn't it? It's you try and build out your unknown unknowns, what could come at you. But I think where we've seen recently over the past couple of months anti-ship mines being used successfully at a rather alarming scale in a certain region, and these are specialists type of equipment being used. Then on the other end of the asymmetric warfare, you've got very low cost equipment that is ballistic, that is able to stop a commercial vessel in its track. And I'm sure for those listening are very aware of what a commercial vessel is in terms of its size and its strength. And actually, sort of 12 months ago, we were seeing ballistic systems being used, but vessels were going on. They were, in reality, a double-hulled ship is a well-armoured vessel in terms of its superstructure and its hull type. And then all of a sudden we saw that step again in terms of the threat increase and how do we stop the engines from moving? How do we bring a vessel to a standstill? And now all of a sudden you've got a sitting duck. And at that point, the threat to life and the threat to cargo and the threat to the environment is extreme at that point. And that, it's to look back on, I think it's quite alarming. I think, as an industry, we're very good at adapting very quickly, both from a threat base, from a commercial, from trade, etc. But I think it's always good to look back and go, how quickly has that happened and how do we stop that happening again in the future?
So, the British Empire was built on the Royal Navy ruling the waves and protecting global trade. Mm-hmm. I think you know where I'm going with this question. Has the US lost control of global maritime security?
I think it's interesting that you bring the US in. I think what the US are very good at doing is setting a clear agenda and vocalizing that agenda. It's my view is that it's not necessarily the US's responsibility to rule the waves. And I think that it's probably the historic aspect, rule Britannia. That was always our vision as an empire, to go out and rule the waves and conquer. I think now there are cohesions in place, combined maritime forces that utilise regional assets, international assets to protect waterways and protect commercial shipping. Clearly, as part of the IMO regulations and UNCLOS, there is an international freedom of navigation, that never existed back in the day. But what we're seeing more now, especially in the areas of extreme contention, so we're looking at sort of Persian Gulf, Indian Ocean, Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, we're seeing, European-funded Atalanta, we're seeing Speedies. Obviously, the US still has dedicated assets in the area, but also part of combined maritime forces. And I think that's that natural evolution where I believe no one country can do it all. There is a separate linear discussion in terms of what is the priority for a state versus what's the priority for commercial shipping and the security of international waterways.
So let's focus in on some of the flashpoint areas. You mentioned there Gulf of Aden, Red Sea, Bab el-Mandeb. Something like 3.5 million barrels a day of crude at any one time can flow through that choke point. Mm-hmm. We saw an easing of tensions there. Kind of what's the status there at the moment?
I mean, I think probably when we last had a talk a couple of weeks ago, we were seeing things sort of settling down. And then in the past couple of days, we've seen the IDF launch multiple attacks on power outlets and power infrastructure within Yemen. And I think naturally that will continue to increase tensions. It's interesting because usually within a maritime threat actor, it's been very regionalised, both in terms of the opportunity, the capability and the intent of why they're doing it. So, what is the intent of that threat actor? Why are they targeting particular ships? Are you creating an opportunity to them? And do they have ships? Do they have weapon systems? What's the capability? But Yemen and the Houthis are very much focused on a situation which is well north of them in terms of the IDF and Hamas. Therefore, it's a really interesting but alarming situation where everything that we see that the Houthis react to is done something that we as an industry can't control, and something that I don't think anyone has the answer at the moment in terms of what the Israeli government plan to do within Gaza. I think we've seen that that has continued to evolve, but then they're continuing to attack the Houthis. So right now, we've seen, I think, as well reported by S&P, it's a 60 to 80% reduction. There's about 40 odd vessels, in the area at any given time. That's come down from huge numbers. So I think we're all starting to see an effect from that. But that is down to, I think there's an unknown question, an unknown understanding. I think it's easy as always to avoid rather than understand. And I think now as an industry, there is a better step forwards in terms of, what's happening there and why. What does that mean to me, a ship owner, and what can I do about it, and what's available to me as a resource. But I still think with the general intent from the IDF and the general intent from Hamas and the general intent from the Houthis, we get to see something in the next 6 months that will show a meaningful impact for ship owners to reconsider.
How sophisticated are the Houthis in terms of their intelligence gathering? I mean, how do they target these ships?
I think there are some traditional methods. We would call it dicking. So individuals, fishermen on the water, using radios, making sure they can identify vessels. I think that's the level one. We've seen active use of UAVs, identify vessels. So Ambrey had a screening area where we knew that UAVs were being used for vessels heading north and south, and vessels would actually report in UAVs screening in the area. And what they're looking for is IMO numbers, vessel names, is the information they've got on their desktop with what's on the water, and that correlates to vessels using non-AS. So even with non-AS, you can obviously radar systems were being used on land. There's limitation of radar systems. It's usually 12, 15 nautical miles, but with that they can get a ping, they can go identify a threat, and they can act upon it. And what the Houthis are good at doing is staying as close to the line as possible in terms of their mandate. What vessels are they targeting and how they're targeting them. And obviously then using those methods to make sure that they are doing what they say they do. I think the Houthis have made 3 or 4 mistakes in terms of potentially their targeting profile. But that's what they've been doing. So
are they the oil tankers that they sank?
So no, there was some that I think had an old European manager, but then had Russian cargo, Chinese cargo on board. So you would say, politically, it's a misidentification, and there wasn't a follow-up attack either. What we're seeing with the Houthis is once they've successfully identified and hit a vessel, they will then continuously go through until either the vessel goes or the threat has, the vessel has deceased or sunk at that time. So, yeah, I think we're seeing what is relatively low-cost available technology to identify vessels. And that then comes down into mitigations for vessel owners, vessel operators that's been advised by companies like Ambrey or the European naval forces as well.
So before we started recording, we were talking about the guy I used to serve in the army with, who unfortunately got killed. I think that must have been early 2000s, sort of offshore Somalia, been on a boat, hard security. What are vessel owners doing now that's different? Are they putting actual more physical security onto boats? Is it electronic countermeasures? Is it more even, in the cybersecurity space? How can they protect themselves? What are you seeing?
I think, once again, a mitigation is always relevant to the threat. And that is how you create risk management. Risk management is, understanding what the threat is, putting together mitigations and creating an assessment and the likelihood of something about to take place. And you would always want that risk to be as low as possible. So what can I do? What can I put in place? Sorry, that was my risk management one.
Right.
For those that aren't...
You've solved it to me.
Yeah, good. So, but we're talking about is mitigation. So what can I do? People, regardless of being Houthis or piracy, boarding my vessel, be it boats, be it weapon systems, yes, armed guards are still the leading factor for that. Depending on the scale of that, yes, you may encourage more armed guards on board and using more rounds. Clearly, though, there's laws and regulations. This isn't a free militia. There are flag states, flag rules. Depending where the company's registered, they will have UK laws that govern them. So there is still a large amount of restriction in terms of what you can do. You can't just turn up tomorrow with 20 guys and put 20 weapon systems and 10,000 rounds. That is illegal. So there are natural rules and regulations which govern and should be.
And there's no sort of, because the level of attacks have just gone up and up. There's no push from the either the maritime governance perspective or to actually ease those restrictions and allow I think more militarization of commercial boats.
Anyone that I've spoken to, either UK, European, US sort of leaders, they will always be supportive in terms of supporting seafarers, supporting transit passengers, but on a case-by-case basis. I haven't seen or heard a general relaxation because you're still dealing with a very serious thing, which is a kinetic capability and weapon systems, which should be a licensed, regulated industry. So I think on a case-by-case basis, and we would always advise, depending on the vessel and the asset, then you should be looking at recommending that and working with flag state and insurers to implement it. But that, once again, we've only talked about one threat there. So when you're talking about aerial threat and the ballistic threat, then what can you do? Are we seeing an increase of electronic countermeasures? Personally, no. Why? Extremely expensive. You might have a vessel that's worth $5 million transiting cargo through the Red Sea. Are they going to spend 100 or 150 grand on a capital outlay for one trip? Of course they're not. On the other hand, you might have a $50 million container vessel that's going, 150 grand's a good investment because I'm going to be back here next week. So I haven't seen that huge implementation of electronic countermeasures. I don't think there's a lot of systems that are well tested, that's affordable to ship owners. So what a warship is using, multi-million dollar pounds of kit, versus a commercial vessel, there's a big disparity in terms of availability to the industry. So then you start looking, okay, how do we change the current operating procedures? So prior to the Houthis, where these were sort of, you were boarding a vessel and you'd create a citadel in the engine room so it's secure, you'd look at boarding measures and BMP practices. Now the citadel is positioned above the waterline. So in the event that a vessel is hit and it takes on water within the engine room and it self-ballasts, and hopefully doesn't sink as a prior target, where can we put a safety room? Where can we look after that crew? I know satellite providers are looking at better communication systems on board the vessel that weren't used back in the Somalian piracy days. And then actually training the crew. The big thing that I always advocate is how do we take this seafarer who's now a humanitarian hero and now also a war fighter to understand these threats better. There was a horrible image right at the back, right at the beginning of one of these attacks where a vessel had been targeted. The vessel turned around, rightfully so, and then it continued on its voyage. A couple of hours later, the crew were on deckside, continuing their repairs. They were still in an elevated threat area. Next thing you see on this video is a missile coming in and hitting the hold and blowing the hold up. Luckily, no injury or fatalities, but that mindset and understanding to seafarers had to be developed really quickly.
Because we have had fatalities for seafarers in that region.
Unfortunately so. And I'm not putting any of that down to bad practice. I think at some point, there is a natural 101 of law, of war. It will happen. It will take place. Whether that is someone in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the Houthis get lucky. And I don't want to be the individual that points to each of those cases, but that's the unfortunate, sad reality that we're facing. This threat is extreme. I'm sure the individuals that served on Somalian piracy vessels, 10, 15 years ago, would really consider twice serving on a vessel today when you've got a ballistic missile flying at you.
Given that air-to-sea sort of missile threats, given the threat from drones now, which definitely you didn't see 10 years ago, is there a case building to put some form of air defence onto, and I'm talking, I think your analogy is good that, if it's a $5 million vessel, maybe not, but if it's a $150 million VLCC, then...
I mean, I've been quite shocked. So working in the industry 15 years, being a vessel owner, vessel operator, sort of risk manager, and have been involved in a variety of products and services. I am always surprised over those 15 years how vessels really haven't developed their design to deal with security. And I would love to speak to that level of industry that goes, the appetite isn't there. Why aren't they doing it? Why haven't we designed ship rails to be anti-boardable? Why haven't we built in part of the bridge or a ballistic superstructure that has all this in from, you're spending $150 million check. I'm sure an extra 200 grand is going to be okay. I'm quite surprised that I've not seen that scale. I know there's ship security plans. I know there's assessments to go into a shipbuilding process, but not to the level, as you mentioned it, that you'd see that adaptation to threat.
Are ship insurers wanting more guarantees, though, in terms of this kind of hard defence?
I think there's two sides, and maybe some of your viewers will split at this point, both stop listening or lean in. But I think there's two sides. I think the insurance industry has gone from not really knowing to having to really understand what they're insuring, why they're insuring it, and is that vessel vulnerable? And I've definitely seen an increase of that in the last 8 months, from major attacks that have taken place, major losses, to, yes, the insurance price goes up, but is $100,000 check really worth a $50 million loss? Not so sure anymore. Whereas actually on the other side, I think there are some very proactive insurers in the market that are leading expectations and standards to go, I want to see this warranted. I want to know you're doing this. And I think that's where the industry will go to. It's a balance, because every insurance company is different: broker, underwriter, capacity provider. But I think collectively the London market, as I know it, has hugely increased, and it's exciting to see that evolution within the market, because someone has to do it. Someone has to step forward going, enough is enough. Here's the new standard. And I think we'll look back in 2-3 years' time and go, yeah, of course. We won't question it.
It's not just the Middle East where we've seen this threat to shipping, though, and maritime assets. Even closer to home here in the UK, the North Sea itself has certainly come under the spotlight since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. What sort of threats have you seen there?
I mean, the North Sea's an interesting one, because obviously, one, it's close to home, but two, I think we've all had to learn on a relatively quiet industry. Even I would make my own assumptions that you use your mobile phone, it's all satellite communication, aerial communication, and the three big power telecoms, power cables, and oil, gas. It's all subsea. Because it's more effective, it's more reliable. But as part of that, it's a huge level of vulnerability. And the UK, as people may not understand, is a great connecting hub. It's connecting sort of western parts of Europe to northern parts of Europe. It's connecting Europe to parts of the States, because it's cheaper to run across land. So we as the UK are very vulnerable when we look at those sort of subsea aspects. But also, we're a little bit further north in terms of Arctic capabilities coming south. I don't see something changing dramatically over the next sort of 12 months in terms of that threat. But I do think now companies are becoming more responsible to it. The fact that we're going to start seeing more use of international freedom for warships coming into the area. We've had reports of, certain state submarines appearing near naval bases. I think that's all part of the political game show, considering the battlefields at this moment in time. But for me, as a UK company, British national, I look at the UK and go, we definitely have to focus on those subsea assets and protection of them to maintain our play. And then I think the rest of Europe becomes into contention as well. They are vulnerable. They are sat there as a fixed asset, well publicised where they are. I would put out and say a pretty stark number, say 90% of them are unprotected and vulnerable. Maybe 10% of them are inaccessible because of depth and areas in the ocean. But all of a sudden, I think what Russia has shown us is quite quickly you can create a lot of confusion, a lot of cost and expense and distraction by dragging an anchor chain through the ocean.
Right. Because I think, this is another lesson from the last 5 years. What was thought previously to be unimaginable has actually happened. No one, if you'd mentioned Nord Stream, that it would be damaged by some sort of undersea attack or whatever it was.
Well, it's the whatever it was that maybe the keyboard warriors, or we can sit here and speculate. And I never want to be pulled into a level of speculation, but a black swan event is something you cannot imagine. So I've been pulled into rooms where we go, well, what's the next one? I went, well, whatever we say now, it'll be something that we can't yet fathom. And that's a pretty daunting thing, considering, as you say, in the last 5 years, we've come from this all being relatively quiet. Prior to the start of the Houthis, people forget that, I know I'm pulling out of Europe, but the Red Sea was closing down. The HRA had shrunk. The HRA was about to disappear. And then we're into the midst of it. The Black Sea at the moment is extremely confusing for everyone involved in terms of what we're seeing within the media versus what we're seeing in the ports, in the waterways.
And there's so little reporting, actually. I mean, it's becoming very opaque what is going on there.
Yeah, and exactly that. And look, I'm not going to get pulled into a land-based conversation, but Ukraine is heavily dependent upon grain trade and imports and exports via some of its major ports, and Russia knew that tactically, taking out the Kherson Dam, obviously the northern ports, and obviously Mykolaiv itself, and Odessa is still operational. Same with Russia. I think they probably didn't realise the vulnerability they are at in terms of some of their eastern Black Sea ports. And then once again, we've seen a slightly different warfare tactic come about where unmanned surface vessels are very effective. And then actually, we talked about this previously, but both Russia and Ukraine aren't targeting vessels freely. They're not acting as a free militia, disrupting commercial trade. Why? They need commercial trade. What they are using very sophisticated intelligence operations where they understand that vessels are importing a threat to their state, be it weapon systems, be it component parts. And I think that's the question for a ship ownership operator now. You might own a ship, but you're outsourcing chartering, you're outsourcing ship management, and next thing you know, you've heard of an attack because a particular container might have been loaded in Turkey that had parts going to a UAV factory. I'm not expecting the ship owner to be aware of that, but I think in today's age, we should be asking the questions and making sure that the policies are set where that doesn't happen. And we've seen this tick for tat, regardless of what's happened in Alaska or what's not happened. The threat has not changed in Ukraine. In fact, on the waterfront, it's intensified.
So the fact that you have several counterparties involved in any shipping transaction, any sort of goods being on the water, it's impossible as an owner to kind of be completely risk-free, right?
No,
you're going to offend someone.
Well, exactly. Look, risk is never zero. So it's at what point of tolerance are you willing to accept? And that's quite a big question for a ship owner. Are you willing to accept high risk because it's high reward, or actually do you not want to go somewhere, i.e. avoid the area altogether? But now we're seeing, component level onboard vessels being targeted because they're going to a particular area. That's the level that the intelligence systems from both states are getting involved in. I think we would be ignorant to think otherwise, that you're going to get away with that. And this is where we've seen vessels that have been calling Russian ports getting hit by sea mines. This is where we've seen vessels on the way to Ukraine, clearly with a component factor within there relating to the war machine being targeted. These aren't affiliation vessels that are called Israel, i.e. what the Houthis are doing. This is machine war focus and that as an understanding for a ship owner that might have just, hang on a minute, I picked up cargo in Southeast Asia, I've made my transit through the Red Sea, I'm now going through the Mediterranean, the largest sort of migration crisis we've ever seen in history, I'm going to head up into the Black Sea and it's all changed again. That is the new world, and that is pretty stark from every level of aspect, from a financier to the insurer to the charterer to the operator to the owner and the ecosystem that sits around it. That has never been at the level, I don't think, in maritime history.
The other thing that's different now in terms of the historical context is the shadow fleet, right? Which is vast. I mean, for the benefit of our listeners, shadow fleet, Iran, Venezuela, Russia now under sanctions, shippers turning off AIS and other methods to remain disguised. How big a problem is it?
It's interesting in terms of, I don't think people realise you can never stay hidden. The technology is at a level, accessibly at a level now where vessels, unless within a 12-hour window, you can somehow change the superstructure, paint colour, and dynamics of your vessel in a 12-hour satellite pass, you're never going to be able to hide. So we talk about the shadow fleet or the grey fleet, but in reality, we all know what they're doing. And I think that's where, what does that mean to us in terms of safety and security? I think the concern comes into the age of these vessels, the type of cargo they're carrying. There's going to be a major disaster at some point in time. And I think that's what everyone's screaming about, saying, unless we set the policies and the understanding and start to implement changes, we're going to see something that's unrecoverable. The fact that it's been going on for a very, very long time, I think the wrong saying to say the industry's not been bothered about it. I think it's more now, a major concern because of that environmental safety impact.
Doesn't it bring us back to the beginning of the conversation, though, that it's about policing?
Yes.
And until someone's prepared to board one of these vessels, seize it, impound it, take the cargo, and say, don't do it anymore, then it'll just go on.
And then who does that? The IMO is a technical body. They set policies delivered by member states. All of those member states that are aware of these activities are in the room. And those member states that are aware of the activity, I'm sure, benefits.
Why doesn't the US do it? I mean, world's largest navy.
Yeah, well, I mean, over the weekend we've seen it's been reported that the US has positioned 7 of its vessels northern part of Venezuela. So, are they looking to implement? Are they going to start applying Russian sanctions pressure on the Venezuelan operations? We've seen that. We've seen off the coast of Malaysia in their anchorage area, well reported by Iranian trade coming out of there, Russian trade coming down. So, I think we're probably at that tipping point now where, from an information perspective, we're aware of the areas of operations, we're aware of the major players policing. And I think that's where OFAC and others have started to really publicise and clamp down. Have we then see a material change economically, financially? I can't comment, but I think the fact that we're talking about it, the fact that we know where it's happening and who's doing it, shows you the increase and shows you that we've had an impact already.
Because you have seen elements of that in the global campaign to stop narcotics being shipped globally, and we're seeing that as a major, not just criminal risk in all around the world, but also geopolitical risk. It's incredibly destabilizing. How big has that problem become on the water?
I mean, it is a $100 million plus a year problem, especially for the P&I clubs. And I think if you pick any of the clubs within the international group of P&Is, they will have a very large number where they're paying on loss of hire, or they're paying on claims and detention fees because a package was put on board their vessel. So we talk about narcotics, let alone the social problem that exists in terms of how they export it, but then the impact to the industry just on delays and detentions alone is huge. But then actually you look at the problem in terms of, okay, there's clearly a need to transport a shipment illegally using a very well-oiled machine. What the maritime industry is good again, and we talked about it, is sharing information. You can download an application in 30 seconds and you've got 250,000 ships at your fingertips. And a lot of the time, due to the technology, it tells you where that ship is going and where it's coming to. Excellent. If I want free cargo or free transshipment, I've got it at my fingertips for free. And then, I think, it's a layman way of explaining that it's not hard to identify vessels. If I want a vessel that's going to Europe, a lot of these vessels, I said to a ship owner recently, if you don't want to be targeted, the best thing you can do is never leave Latin America. Trade within Latin America. Why? No one wants their shipment to come back, return to sender. I've been grateful enough to work in some programs where we've worked with container liners going from US to parts of the Gulf and down, and we've successfully been able to mitigate those threats. And it starts with the port staff, the port terminals, the staff on board, the SOPs, and how those vessels are communicating out to the industry in terms of what they're doing. You go on any major ship liners, they'll tell you their liners. They'll tell you where they're going, what they do. They're proud to communicate it. So it's really going down through all layers of stopping this. So I think it's going to continue to be a major problem, but it's whether, unfortunately, whether that problem is big enough for the ship manager to want to deal with at that particular time. I've definitely seen within LATAM alone, there's been a huge base from United Nations focusing on sort of the drug and anti-narcotics program. I've seen ports step up their levels of security, and I've definitely heard ship owners doing more, but that doesn't mean it's not growing. And like you say, going back down to the previous claim, the amount of events now, I think it's the reporting is better, so we're hearing more of it coming out. But it goes down just to good basic understanding of threat and some basic levels of mitigation will reduce that risk for ship owners immediately. So,
Josh, we're trying to set a precedent on the Look Forward podcast to end on a positive note. Yeah. What do you feel optimistic about in terms of global maritime trade and global maritime security?
That's an interesting one. We've not pre-scripted this.
I thought I'd throw this one in there.
No, it's good. I think yeah, maybe a couple of things. I've said it already, maybe subliminally within the podcast so far. I have been impressed by the resilience of the industry, and I think we can do ourselves proud where if we are willing to work together we are resilient and we're able to overcome quite quickly. Whether that is a crude oil tanker that's on fire, stopping environmental disaster, whether that's a new threat actor, the whole industry communicating best practice and deviating. For me and my work that I do, it's been impressive to see that. It's painful at times, but never been done before. So I think we have to continue that. We've got to be private, military, commercial organisations continuing to drive a stronger agenda together. That, and I know that if the IMO Secretary General was in here, he'd be saying the same thing. It's about that partnership. It's about the seafarers. I think the outlook in terms of these problems drive change. They drive some opportunity for traders. They drive opportunity for charterers, and I think we'll see. War brings two things. It's the manufacturing aspect, and then brings opportunity for economics. So I think even in these challenging times, there's an opportunity for companies to do well, to accelerate. I don't think we can ignore that. We're all here because we are commercial organisations. I think it's almost a dirty word. And I think the sooner we talk about the fact that we're all in this to make money, but we want to do it in an ethical, good practice way, I think you get some real transparency between people going, well, what can we do in this situation that's good? And how do we become more adaptable in the future when this happens?
And having more conversations like this, I guess, as well, talking about it.
Exactly. And I think people shouldn't be afraid of doing it. I think the biggest thing I always try and do, both in leadership and management, is the sooner you hold your hands up and say, well, I don't know, but damn, I'm going to find out as quickly as possible. That as a culture within the maritime sector, I think will have years of success to come, regardless of what challenges come around the corner, regardless of the next major launch or potential war, regardless of the next threat, be it type of asymmetric or type of technology. Exactly that. These kind of conversations, being honest, working together, will become a more resilient, more profitable future.
Thanks, Joss. A great way to end the podcast. Talk more, listen more, and ask more questions. And if you want to hear more from the Look Forward podcast, check us out on YouTube. Check us out on www.spglobal.com. Search for Look Forward. And also you can download past episodes and future episodes on Spotify and the Apple Podcast Store. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.